Imagine two men, two husbands, two fathers, two people who should have been protectors, but instead became the center of two of the most controversial murder cases in modern American history. What's unusual is this: no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no direct forensic link tying either man to the crime. And yet, both would eventually become symbols of guilt. Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson, two men who shared nothing except the last name and an uncanny ability to leave almost no evidence behind. One was a fertilizer salesman from California, preparing for fatherhood. The other, a seasoned police sergeant from Illinois, preparing for his next marriage. Different backgrounds, different lifestyles, different motives, but one chilling similarity: both nearly outsmarted everyone. Scott Peterson used calmness as a weapon. The grieving husband, the soft-spoken victim, the man who appeared supportive, devastated, broken. He played his role carefully, smoothly, almost flawlessly. Drew Peterson used arrogance, smirking on live TV, mocking reporters, treating his missing wife like gossip instead of tragedy. A cop who believed he understood the game better than anyone investigating him. Two performances, two masks, two men who thought they could bend the justice system to their will. And for a time, it worked. Scott built a timeline that looked clean: a fishing trip, a quiet morning, a normal day. Drew staged a bathtub accident so believable that law enforcement ruled it accidental for years. But killers leave clues, even when they think they haven't. Not fingerprints, not bloodstains, not weapons, patterns, lies, contradictions, behavior. The things they never expected would betray them. Because some crimes don't unravel through physical proof. They unravel through the psychology of the person who committed them. And that is the story you are about to witness. How two men, both almost perfect in their planning, were undone not by evidence, but by who they truly were. Before investigators ever collect evidence, before juries ever hear testimony, before the public forms their opinions, there is something far more powerful shaping the story: the mask a suspect chooses to wear. Some hide behind tears. Some hide behind confidence. Some perform innocence. Some perform superiority. And in the story of Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson, two men who shared a last name but almost nothing else, their masks became the single most defining part of their cases. Because the moment their wives vanished, both men stepped into a role, a persona, a character they believed would protect them. Scott's mask was quiet. Drew's mask was loud. Two opposite performances, both designed to keep the world from seeing the truth. Scott Peterson, the soft-spoken husband who never raised his voice. When Laci Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve, Scott didn't explode in grief. He didn't fall apart. He didn't tremble, cry uncontrollably, or make desperate public pleas. Instead, he became calm, measured, almost eerily controlled. He spoke gently during interviews. He answered questions without hesitation. He maintained a clean, composed appearance, even in the chaos of a missing person search. This wasn't coincidence. It was a performance. Scott chose a role he believed Americans trusted: the calm, rational man trying to hold himself together. But this is what investigators learned early on. Real grief is messy. Real shock is unpredictable. Real fear cracks people open. They shake. They repeat themselves. They lose composure. They forget details. They break down without warning. Scott didn't. And while the public didn't immediately notice, detectives did. He was too smooth, too prepared, too emotionally steady. It wasn't that he was mourning calmly. It was that he wasn't mourning at all. When questioned about his unborn son, he didn't cry. When asked about the possibility of danger, he didn't panic. When Laci's family suffered and pleaded, Scott stayed in the shadows of their pain, never matching their urgency, never reflecting their fear. To some people, he seemed mature. To others, he seemed cold. What they didn't know yet was that Scott had a reason to keep calm, a reason that would shatter the entire mask later. Amber Frey, the girlfriend he hid while pretending to be a grieving husband. But in the beginning, Scott believed he was playing the part perfectly. Drew Peterson, the smirking cop who wanted the camera on him. If Scott's mask was silence, Drew's was noise. Where Scott tried to blend in, Drew tried to dominate every room he walked into. When his fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, vanished, Drew didn't disappear from the public eye. He ran toward it. He stood in front of reporters with a smirk. He cracked jokes. He made sarcastic comments about his missing wife. He behaved less like a man in crisis and more like a man giving a late-night talk show interview. It was shocking, it was unsettling, and it was intentional. Drew had been a police sergeant for decades. He knew the press. He knew investigators. He knew optics. His mask wasn't innocence. His mask was untouchability. He projected the confidence of someone who believed, I know this system better than you. I know what you're looking for, and you're not going to find it. He walked around with the swagger of a man who had beaten the system before. After all, Kathleen Savio, his third wife, had died in what investigators originally accepted as a household accident. A tragedy, they thought, not a crime. Drew never forgot that victory. So when Stacy disappeared, he assumed he could win again, appear strong, appear amused, appear annoyed by the accusations, not weakened by them. But arrogance is a slippery mask. It doesn't hide the truth. It highlights it. Every time he smirked, people wondered what he was hiding. Every time he joked, people wondered why he wasn't worried. Every time he mocked the investigation, people thought, an innocent man wouldn't act like that. His mask wasn't protecting him. It was cracking on live television. Two men, two masks, one goal, control the story. At first glance, Scott and Drew looked like complete opposites. Scott, quiet, soft-spoken, stoic, comfortable in the background. Drew, loud, sarcastic, bitterly confident, hungry for the spotlight. But their masks, different as they were, served the same purpose. Control the narrative before the truth could control them. A missing wife is a story. A grieving husband is a role. A family tragedy is a stage. And both men desperately wanted to be the ones directing the scene. Scott controlled the narrative with composure. Drew controlled the narrative with cockiness. Both were manipulating public perception, but they were doing it in ways that reflected their psychology. Why their masks worked at first. In the early days of both investigations, their performances were surprisingly effective. Scott sound, sympathy. People saw a clean-cut husband with a soft voice and no criminal past. He looked like a man in shock, not a man with motive. Drew found authority. People saw a veteran cop, someone who understood danger and death, someone who knew better than civilians. For a short window, their masks bought them time. Time without suspicion. Time without pressure. Time to look innocent. But masks are temporary, and cracks always appear. When Scott's mask began to slip, the first crack wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. Scott began telling different people different versions of the same story. Small inconsistencies, small shifts in details. And then came the detail he could never hide. He told Amber Frey, his girlfriend, that he was spending Christmas alone, that he had lost his wife, that he was a widower. He said this before Laci even went missing. That revelation destroyed the calm husband mask in one blow. The public stopped seeing a grieving husband. They started seeing a man rehearsing an identity he hadn't earned yet. The mask fell off. The suspicion began. When Drew's mask began to crack, Drew's downfall began not with a new revelation, but with repeated exposure. The more he talked, the more suspicious he became. His laughter felt forced. His comments felt cruel. His jokes felt manipulative. Reporters went from confused to uncomfortable to convinced something was wrong. Then came the pattern investigators could no longer ignore. 3 wives with accusations of abuse. 2 wives with stories of control. 1 wife dead in a bathtub. And now Stacy vanished. The arrogant mask didn't make Drew look powerful. It made him look guilty. Unlike Scott, whose mask collapsed with one major revelation, Drew's fell, apart one smirk at a time. The psychology behind their masks. The most revealing part of their performances wasn't what they hid. It was why they hid it. Scott's calmness wasn't emotional control. It was emotional emptiness. Drew's cockiness wasn't confidence. It was dominance. Scott's mask protected him from suspicion. Drew's mask protected him from vulnerability. Both masks revealed more about their personalities than they ever expected. Scott wanted to be liked. Drew wanted to be feared. Scott hid guilt with silence. Drew hid guilt with volume. Both underestimated one thing. Investigators don't fall for performances. They study them. And these performances told detectives more than evidence ever could. Why this section matters for the documentary. This isn't just an introduction to their personalities. It sets up the foundation of the documentary's theme. 2 men who nearly beat the system by understanding one truth. A killer doesn't have to hide evidence if he can hide himself. But masks only work until the wrong person starts asking the right questions. And for Scott and Drew, the right questions were coming. Before the public forms an opinion, before a jury hears a single argument, there is a hidden battle taking place that most people never see. The battle of knowledge. Because when a wife goes missing or turns up dead, the husband is almost always the first person investigators look at. And whether that husband knows the system or knows nothing about it changes everything. This is where Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson diverge so sharply that it almost feels like they're from 2 different worlds. One man walked into the investigation blind. The other walked into it with decades of police training and insider experience. One was an outsider, one was an insider. And that split, that knowledge gap, defined how each man behaved, how investigators responded, and how close each came to escaping justice. Drew Peterson, the cop who thought he knew every move. Drew wasn't just familiar with law enforcement. He was law enforcement, a veteran police sergeant with years of experience responding to domestic calls, interrogating suspects, writing reports, and understanding how crimes are processed. He didn't just know how investigations worked. He had participated in hundreds of them. He knew what detectives prioritize, how they analyze statements, how crime scenes are interpreted, how domestic homicides often unfold, what evidence is most damaging, and most importantly, what mistakes get criminals caught. That knowledge wasn't just useful, it was dangerous in the hands of someone like Drew. Because Drew believed this knowledge gave him control, and control was something he craved in every area of life. He knew how to stage scenes. When Kathleen Savio was found dead in her bathtub in 2004, investigators initially accepted the explanation as a household accident. No sign of forced entry, no eyewitness, no murder weapon. What they didn't realize was this: the man who staged that scene knew exactly what detectives look for and what they look past. He knew how to intimidate witnesses, ex-wives, neighbors, family members, people who might speak up about abuse or violence. Drew didn't need to threaten anyone directly. His reputation in law enforcement already did that. He knew how to manipulate the investigation. When Stacy disappeared, Drew acted not like a man in crisis, but like a man trained to stay steps ahead. He didn't panic, he didn't run, he didn't change his behavior. Because in Drew's mind, appearing calm wasn't a performance, it was strategy. He believed he was smarter than investigators. And for a while, he was. Scott Peterson, the civilian who built an alibi instead of a strategy. Scott, on the other hand, didn't know anything about police work. He didn't know how timelines are reconstructed. He didn't know how phone records are analyzed. He didn't know how emotional responses are evaluated. He didn't know how quickly inconsistencies become red flags. His approach to hiding his crime wasn't tactical, it was theatrical. Instead of using police knowledge, Scott used people knowledge. He relied on social perception, not investigative science. Scott created an alibi, not a strategy. His fishing trip story, used to explain his whereabouts the morning Laci went missing, wasn't built on investigative insight. It was built on the belief that a calm, normal-sounding explanation would be enough. He focused on appearing innocent, not on avoiding evidence. He didn't expect his calls to Amber Frey to surface. He didn't expect his calm demeanor to raise suspicion. He didn't expect his lies to unravel so quickly. Scott wasn't thinking like a detective. He was thinking like a salesman, someone who believed that if he delivered his story convincingly enough, people would buy it. Where Drew relied on procedure, Scott relied on performance. And that difference shaped everything that came after. The insider advantage, Drew's dangerous expertise. When Drew's wives were in danger, they weren't just facing a violent husband. They were facing a man who understood exactly how to get away with violence. Most domestic abusers escalate their behavior, but make glaring mistakes. Drew didn't make the typical mistakes. He knew how to make injuries look accidental, how to construct a believable sequence of events, how to avoid leaving forensic evidence, how to predict investigative priorities, how to speak to police without raising suspicion. Because he'd been the police, this turned every interaction with Drew into an uphill battle for investigators. When Kathleen died, her death was treated as an accident because the person responsible created a scene that matched exactly what police would expect. When Stacy disappeared, Drew inserted himself into the narrative strategically, not like a suspect, but like a man who knew how to appear cooperative while giving investigators nothing. Drew weaponized his insider knowledge. He used the system he once served to shield himself from the same scrutiny he had once applied to others. And that advantage merely allowed him to outsmart an entire investigative team. The outsider disadvantage, Scott's mistakes that gave him away. Meanwhile, Scott, without any insider knowledge, made mistake after mistake, and he didn't even realize they were mistakes. Mistake 1. Predictable lies. Detectives quickly noticed that Scott's details shifted. He wasn't doing it intentionally. He simply didn't know that investigators track even the smallest inconsistencies. Mistake 2. Emotional detachment. Scott assumed staying calm made him look innocent. He didn't know law enforcement trains officers to look for emotional incongruence. Mistake 3. Underestimating phone records. Scott didn't think investigators would trace his calls. He didn't realize digital footprints are often more damning than physical ones. Mistake 4. The affair. He didn't understand that motive is not just evidence, it's narrative. And motive can turn circumstantial pieces into a complete picture. Scott was not a criminal mastermind. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't tactical. He was an ordinary man who underestimated how complicated an investigation becomes when your story starts falling apart. Where Drew stayed steps ahead, Scott fell behind almost immediately. 2 men, 2 approaches, same goal. Despite the huge contrast in their backgrounds, both men shared one chilling similarity. They believed they could outmaneuver investigators. But their methods came from different worlds. Drew's method: leverage insider knowledge, predict investigative sequences, control the crime scene, use authority as a shield, speak with confidence to disarm suspicion. Scott's method: build a believable alibi, present himself as calm and harmless, deny emotional involvement, avoid conflict, rely on charm rather than strategy. These contrasting approaches reveal something important about the psychology of each man. Drew's arrogance came from expertise. Scott's came from ignorance. One overestimated his intelligence. The other underestimated the investigators. But both led to the same outcome. They were undone by what they thought they understood. Why the knowledge gap matters in this documentary. This section is crucial because it frames the rest of the story. For Drew Peterson, the challenge for investigators wasn't finding mistakes. It was recognizing them beneath the layers of expert staging. For Scott Peterson, the challenge wasn't the complexity of the crime. It was uncovering the motives and lies hidden behind his calm exterior. Drew's insider knowledge made him harder to catch. Scott's outsider ignorance made him easier to expose. But here's the twist. Both men believed knowledge, or confidence, would save them. Both ultimately learned that no one is smarter than the truth. Before any crime scene is examined, before any suspect is interviewed, before any jury hears a word of testimony, investigators ask one question that shapes the entire case. Who was the victim? Because the truth is simple yet powerful. Victims tell stories, even when they can no longer speak. And in the cases of Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson, their victims revealed something investigators desperately needed to understand. One was part of a pattern. One was part of a plan. 2 different dynamics, 2 different motives, 2 different paths to uncovering the truth. But both stories mattered because both women deserve justice. Drew Peterson's victims: a pattern of control, escalation, and violence. To understand Drew Peterson, you must first understand the women he chose. Because Drew didn't pick partners randomly, he picked women who fit his needs, his insecurities, and his desire for control. Men like Drew don't begin with murder. They begin with dominance, then escalate. And that escalation can be traced through every one of his marriages. Wife number 1 and wife number 2. The warning signs no one took seriously. Before Kathleen and before Stacy, Drew had 2 earlier marriages. These wives described similar traits: jealousy, verbal abuse, strict control over finances, monitoring phone calls, unpredictable temper, emotional manipulation. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, domestic violence didn't carry the same weight it does today. Many women stayed silent. Many police departments dismissed domestic disputes as family disagreements, even when danger was present. And Drew, a police officer himself, knew this. He used the era's weaknesses to his advantage. He built a reputation at home that was entirely different from the one he presented in uniform. These early marriages didn't end in death, but they laid the groundwork for the pattern investigators would later uncover. Drew Peterson was a man who grew more dangerous with time. Kathleen Savio, the wife who tried to warn the world. Kathleen was Drew's third wife, and her story is the most heartbreaking part of the pattern, because she saw the danger coming before anyone else did. She wrote letters. She filed police reports. She told friends and family, "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." Kathleen's life with Drew was marked by escalating violence, threats, manipulation, physical altercations, financial control, fear for her safety. She told neighbors she believed Drew would kill her and make it look like an accident. She said it so many times that multiple people remembered it years later. And then, in 2004, Kathleen was found dead in a bathtub. The scene looked accidental. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no weapon. It fit the profile of what an experienced cop could create. The coroner ruled her death an accident. Case closed. But Kathleen's voice didn't stay silent. Years later, during the investigation into Stacy's disappearance, her body was exhumed. This time, multiple forensic pathologists agreed. Her death was a homicide, a staged drowning. Kathleen had predicted her own fate, and the world finally listened. Stacy Peterson, the wife who vanished without a trace. If Kathleen's case showed a pattern, Stacy's case showed the final escalation. Stacy was much younger than Drew, a teenager when their relationship began. He offered protection, stability, and the illusion of emotional security. But like Kathleen, she eventually saw beneath the mask. She told family members. She was afraid. Drew was controlling. Drew monitored her every move. Drew had a dark side. She wanted to leave the marriage. She feared what Drew would do if she tried. Most chillingly, Stacy confided to her pastor, "I know what happened to Kathleen, because he told me." That confession would become one of the most damning pieces of Drew's pattern. And then Stacy disappeared. No body, no trace, no farewell, nothing. Just absence, and a husband who smiled on television instead of searching for her. Stacy's disappearance wasn't just another case. It was the moment the pattern became undeniable. 3 wives with warnings. 2 wives who feared for their lives. 1 wife dead. 1 wife missing. This wasn't coincidence. This was escalation. Drew's violence didn't happen suddenly. It grew. It adapted. And it hid behind a badge that gave him authority and protection. Kathleen's death and Stacy's disappearance weren't separate tragedies. They were chapters of the same story. A story of a man who believed he was untouchable until the pattern exposed him. Scott Peterson's victim, a singular calculated plan. Scott Peterson's story was entirely different. Where Drew had a pattern across marriages, Scott had 1 victim, but a crime so meticulously planned, it shocked the nation. To understand Scott's crime, you must understand who Laci Peterson was and what she meant to him. Laci Peterson, a woman full of life, love, and expectation. Laci wasn't just Scott's wife. She was a dreamer. a planner, a woman excited to become a mother. She was 8 months pregnant with their son Connor. She was preparing for Christmas. She was talking about nursery decorations. Her life was filled with warmth, humor, ambition, deep love for her family, dreams of motherhood, optimism about her future. But Scott didn't see a future. He saw a burden, a responsibility he didn't want, a life he didn't want, a marriage he no longer valued. And because Scott's crime didn't stem from years of escalating violence, it was harder for people to see coming. Laci didn't fear for her life. She didn't predict danger. She didn't imagine Scott was capable of anything dark. She trusted him completely, and that trust was the weapon he used. A singular plan, not heat, not rage, but calculation. Scott's crime wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't explosive. It was planned. Every detail, the fishing trip, the timing, the calm behavior afterward, suggested preparation. This wasn't a pattern of abuse across relationships. This wasn't escalation from previous violence. This was a one-time decision driven by a single, powerful motive: freedom. Freedom from fatherhood. Freedom from marriage. Freedom from responsibility. Freedom to live the fantasy life he told Amber Frey about: traveling, being unencumbered, reinventing himself. Scott's crime was not the product of boiling rage, but chilling selfishness. He didn't need multiple victims to expose a pattern. His behavior before and after Laci's disappearance revealed everything: the affair, the lies, the emotional detachment, the contradictory stories, the lack of urgency, the empty charm, the rehearsed calmness. Where Drew's pattern unfolded over years, Scott's pattern unfolded over days. Before the crime, deception. After the crime, performance. During the investigation, manipulation. Scott didn't need multiple victims to show a psychological pattern. His behavior surrounding Laci's disappearance exposed a man willing to sacrifice anyone for his own desires. Patterns versus plans. What investigators saw. The most important difference between Drew and Scott lies. Drew Peterson left a pattern, a long trail of domestic violence, fear, threats, escalating control, and a repeated history of wives in danger. Investigators eventually recognized that each marriage exposed a new layer of who Drew really was. Scott Peterson left a plan. One meticulously constructed timeline, one victim, one motive, one calculated attempt to create a new life. Scott wasn't escalating, he was escaping. Drew wasn't escaping, he was dominating. Drew's pattern convicted him. Scott's plan convicted him. Two different routes, same destination. The truth. Why this section matters for the documentary. Understanding the victims isn't just about honoring their stories. Though that is important, it's about understanding the behavioral signatures of the killers. Because every killer leaves a signature. Drew's signature was repetition. A pattern that grew darker and more violent with each marriage. And that is why their stories matter. In most murder cases, the path to justice is built on hard evidence: fingerprints, DNA, blood patterns, weapons, surveillance footage. But the cases of Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson were nothing like most murder cases. There were no weapons, no eyewitnesses, no confessions, no forensics that directly proved guilt. Just absence, just silence, just contradiction, just patterns. And yet, both men were eventually brought to justice through a different kind of evidence. one that is often misunderstood by the public but deeply respected by investigators: circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is not weaker than physical proof. It's not less serious or less reliable. In many cases, it is the only kind of evidence smart criminals leave behind. Because while forensic evidence can be wiped away, behavior never can. This section is the heart of your documentary. The battleground, where both cases were fought without the luxury of physical proof. Drew Peterson, the forensics of a staged accident. When Kathleen Savio was found dead in her bathtub in 2004, the immediate reaction was simple. It looks like an accident. No forced entry, no broken objects, no bruising that screamed homicide, no weapon, no signs of a struggle. Her hair was wet. Her body was in a vulnerable, relaxed position. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. To a casual observer, even to a trained one, the scene appeared consistent with a tragic household slip. And that's because the man who staged the scene knew exactly what a tragic household slip looked like. Drew Peterson didn't just hide evidence. He designed the scene to mimic the kind of scenarios he had seen dozens of times in his police career. He understood typical fall patterns, water, dynamics, how bruising should look, how injuries might occur naturally, what accidents generally look like to investigators. He didn't leave fingerprints because he didn't need to. He didn't hide a weapon because he didn't use one. He didn't need a staged intruder because that would raise suspicion. All he needed was a believable accident. And for years, that accident fooled everyone. The exhumation that changed everything. Only after Stacy's disappearance did investigators revisit Kathleen's case. What they discovered in the second autopsy shattered the illusion of an accident. Suddenly, bruises were inconsistent. Lacerations didn't align with a fall. The positioning of the body didn't match accidental drowning. The dryness of certain parts of her body indicated staging. The angle of injuries suggested force, not a slip. It became clear. Kathleen did not slip. She was placed. The forensic reconstruction revealed no evidence of a struggle because the victim was overwhelmed quickly. No splashes or displacement consistent with falling because the scene was controlled. No natural bruising patterns because the injuries were inflicted by another person. Drew's insider knowledge initially helped him hide the truth. But ironically, it also became his downfall, because once investigators realized the scene had been staged using professional-level awareness, everything pointed back to the man who had that expertise. Drew Peterson, the police sergeant. Stacy Peterson, the case with no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence. If Kathleen's case was frustrating, Stacy's case was infuriating. She didn't just die. She vanished. No body, no trace, no blood, no personal items, no crime scene. Just absence. And yet, that absence was the evidence. Because the only person who benefited from Stacy disappearing, the only person with motive, opportunity, and history, was the man she feared the most, Drew. Investigators used circumstantial clues to build their case. 1. Stacy told multiple people she planned to leave Drew. When victims of domestic violence express a fear of leaving, the danger skyrockets. 2. Stacy confided that Drew killed Kathleen. This statement connected the two cases and destroyed Drew's alibi. 3. Drew's timeline made no sense. Details shifted, explanations changed, and his last scene statements contradicted basic logic. 4. Drew's behavior was bizarre. He didn't join searches. He laughed in interviews. He mocked reporters. Guilt changes behavior, even when guilt is hidden. 5. He provided no consistent explanation for where Stacy went. A missing wife is not someone who simply ran away, leaving children behind. His past pattern predicted danger. Past behavior is the strongest predictor of future behavior, especially in domestic homicide. Without a body, forensic science had nothing to work with. But forensic psychology had everything it needed. Scott Peterson, the timeline that destroyed his alibi. While Drew fought battles in forensics and behavioral patterns, Scott fought his own war, a war built entirely on time. Scott believed his fishing alibi at the Berkeley Marina would protect him. It did the opposite. Investigators immediately found issues. His timing made no sense. Scott left home at a time that didn't match his usual routine. He claimed to go fishing in weather that was cold and unfriendly. He chose a location he had rarely visited. His route was inconsistent. His movements didn't match typical behavior. They matched intentional distancing. 3. His phone records contradicted him. Calls he placed, calls he didn't place, and timing gaps all worked against him. 4. He couldn't account for several critical minutes. Those minutes, investigators believed, were when Laci died. 5. The bodies of Laci and Connor washed ashore near his fishing spot. Not proof of murder, but proof of lie, because Scott claimed he had no idea why they would be there. The fishing alibi wasn't just suspicious. It became the central piece of circumstantial evidence. Because if Scott wasn't where he said he was, then where was he? And what was he doing? Behavioral evidence, the invisible fingerprint. Scott and Drew both left something behind, not physical traces, but psychological ones. Investigators began noticing patterns. Scott Peterson's behavioral red flags. No urgency when Laci went missing. No emotional outbursts. No visible grief. No active participation in searches. Lies about the affair with Amber Frey. Oddly calm phone calls. Rehearsed responses. Scott behaved not like a man who lost his wife, but like a man trying to avoid losing control. Drew Peterson's behavioral red flags. Smirking during interviews, joking about Stacy's disappearance, contradictory statements, erratic explanations, attempts to discredit Stacy, efforts to blame others, overconfidence in public. Drew behaved not like a man seeking his wife, but like a man mocking the system. Behavior is evidence. Silence is evidence. Contradiction is evidence. Inconsistency is evidence. And both men left a trail of all four. The power of circumstantial evidence. The public often misunderstands circumstantial evidence, but investigators know a truth that every courtroom veteran learns. Circumstantial evidence is not weaker than direct evidence. It is simply different. Think about it like this. If you go outside and see wet streets, people holding umbrellas, puddles, water running down gutters, you didn't see rain fall, but rain is the only explanation that makes sense. That is circumstantial reasoning, and it is the foundation of countless murder convictions. Because most killers don't leave a clean trail of evidence behind them. They leave patterns, timelines, lies, contradictions, and behavior. Those pieces, when assembled, form a picture. And the picture is the truth. Why this section matters for the documentary. Because it reveals the single most important theme. Smart killers leave no physical evidence, but they always leave circumstantial evidence. Scott left a bad alibi, a secret affair, an impossible timeline, a contradictory behavior. Bodies near his fishing spot. Drew left a stage scene, escalating domestic violence, 2 missing dead wives, behavioral arrogance. A pattern only a killer would create. Both cases lacked the classic smoking gun, but both had overwhelming circumstantial structures. These structures became the prosecution's weapon, because when killers erase the science, they expose the psychology. And that is often far more revealing. Every criminal with something to hide eventually reaches a crossroads. Do they go silent, or do they take control? Most suspects withdraw, terrified they'll say the wrong thing. But Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson were not like most suspects. Both men, in their own styles, attempted to manipulate the narrative so effectively that, for a time, the public didn't know what to believe. Their strategies were opposite, but their purpose was the same: control the story, control perception, control the outcome. This section explores how both men weaponized image, tone, behavior, and media to shift suspicion away from themselves, and how those very attempts revealed the truth. Scott Peterson, the perfect husband performance. While Drew thrived on loudness, Scott relied on quiet manipulation. Scott was not a dramatic man. He wasn't charismatic in a flashy way. He wasn't bold or confrontational, but he understood something far more subtle. People trust calmness. People trust gentleness. People trust the image of a devoted family man. And Scott knew how to perform that. Scott in public, a controlled portrait. When Laci disappeared, Scott knew the world would watch him. And he crafted every gesture, every expression, every word with precision. He didn't act angry. He didn't lash out. He didn't appear overwhelmed. Instead, he stood in front of recorders with steady eyes and rehearsed sadness. He spoke softly, as though any sudden movement might break him. He maintained a polished appearance, clean clothes, composed posture, neat hair, even in the middle of a crisis. He didn't cry loudly. He didn't scream or fall apart. His grief was quiet, tidy, almost cinematic. But investigators noticed something off. Scott's emotions didn't fluctuate. They stayed flat, even when the situation worsened. Real grief explodes and deflates. Scott's grief stayed linear. And that linearity was unnatural. The vigils, a husband without urgency. At the candlelight vigils for Laci, Scott looked like a ghost in the background. He stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders down, face neutral. He didn't run to the microphone. He didn't plead for her return. While Laci's family sobbed, Scott barely reacted. The contrast spoke volumes. Detectives noticed that Scott often avoided eye contact with Laci's mother. He didn't show the instinctive protectiveness of a grieving husband. It felt less like mourning and more like maintenance. Like he was preserving a story, not searching for his wife. The lie that broke the performance, Amber Frey. The moment Amber Frey's name entered the investigation, Scott's narrative collapsed. Amber wasn't just a mistress. She was the key to understanding Scott's psychology. Scott told Amber he was single, childless, and later, a widower. He said this before Laci went missing. His manipulation of Amber revealed his manipulation of the world. Scott wasn't lying to cover a crime. He was lying to cover a different life. A life where Laci didn't exist. A life where Connor wasn't on the way. a life where he wasn't tied down by responsibilities he never wanted. The moment the affair went public, Scott's perfect husband act became a performance unraveling in real time. And the public turned on him. His attempts to shape the narrative were no longer convincing. They were transparent. Scott didn't just lie to investigators, he lied to everyone. And the cracks in his persona were now visible to the world. Drew Peterson, the cop who turned a crime into a stage. If Scott's narrative manipulation was quiet and calculated, Drew's was loud, arrogant, and shockingly brazen. Where Scott tried to appear innocent, Drew tried to appear untouchable. He didn't avoid cameras, he chased them. He didn't crumble under pressure, he smirked at it. He didn't fear public scrutiny, he played with it like it was entertainment. And to investigators, that was one of the biggest red flags of all. Drew's media blitz, a performance of power. After Stacy disappeared, Drew practically became a public figure overnight. He gave multiple TV interviews, joked with reporters, flirted on camera, made sarcastic remarks about the investigation, mocked the idea that he was a suspect, argued playfully with talk show hosts, even laughed at questions about Stacy's whereabouts. It was shocking. Most men whose wives vanish are distraught, not amused. Most beg for help, not attention. Most cry, not smirk. But Drew understood something Scott didn't. Media attention can both shield and confuse. Drew believed that by flooding the airwaves with his voice, his confidence, his jokes, he could shift focus, manipulate public perception, make investigators look incompetent, create doubt before evidence was even presented. In his mind, the louder he was, the harder it would be for investigators to control the narrative. Turning suspicion into entertainment. One of the most disturbing elements of Drew's behavior was how he turned Stacy's disappearance into a spectacle. He joked about dating. He flirted with younger women publicly. He teased reporters with smirks like he was on a game show. He treated the investigation as a challenge, something to outwit, outmaneuver, outplay. He wore arrogance like armor. But arrogance doesn't hide guilt. It reveals it. Every time Drew opened his mouth, investigators noticed inconsistencies, contradictions, dismissiveness, mockery. He wasn't defending himself. He was performing. And performance is fragile. Performance cracks. The past that became impossible to ignore. Drew's public persona could distract, but it couldn't erase his history. When the media spotlight intensified, so did the scrutiny of his past marriages, Kathleen's suspicious accident, Stacy's claims of fear, patterns of domestic violence, financial control, isolation tactics, threats of harm, jealousy and rage, possession of firearms, temper outbursts. Drew's attempt to manipulate the public only led reporters and investigators deeper into his private life. His arrogance magnified the pattern investigators needed to see. Drew didn't just fail to hide his crimes, he broadcast them through his behavior. Despite their opposite styles, Scott and Drew shared one fatal flaw. They underestimated how closely investigators study behavior. Murder isn't just solved in labs. It's solved in how people speak, act, contradict themselves, and attempt to control perception. Scott's failure. He was too calm, too composed, too detached. Humans don't act like that during tragedy. Drew's failure. He was too loud, too arrogant, too amused, too contradictory, too eager for attention. Innocent men don't smirk while their wives are missing. Guilty ones often didn't protect them, they exposed them. The psychology behind their narrative control. Both men's behaviors emerged from deeper psychological traits. Scott's personality profile: conflict avoidant, emotionally detached, skilled at appearing harmless, lies through omission, charms quietly, manipulates subtly, presents a nice guy image, avoids confrontation. For Scott, performance was a survival mechanism. He believed people wouldn't suspect someone who acted gentle and controlled. Drew's personality profile: dominant, narcissistic traits, craves control, intimidates confidently, manipulates through force, weaponizes charm and arrogance, projects superiority, invites confrontation. For Drew, performance was a dominance display. He believed arrogance equaled immunity. Two different psychologies. One shared belief: I can control how the world sees me. They were wrong. How public opinion shifted. Public perception matters in high-profile cases, and both men lost control of that perception in dramatic ways. For Scott, once Amber Frey stepped forward, the public no longer saw a grieving father-to-be. They saw a liar, a cheater, a man already pretending to live without his wife and unborn child. 4. Drew, his televised smirks, his condescending tone, his bizarre jokes, all of it turned him into a villain before the trial even began. People didn't need forensic proof to distrust him. His behavior was enough. Why this section matters for the documentary. This section reinforces a critical truth. Murderers don't just hide evidence. They hide behind behavior. Scott hid behind kindness. Drew hid behind confidence. But behavior is the evidence most people ignore, because you can fake tears. You can fake innocence. You can fake cooperation. But you cannot fake authenticity. Not for long, not under pressure, not when the world is watching. And in both cases, their masks didn't slip, they shattered. Every killer who believes he's outsmarted the world eventually enters the most dangerous phase of the investigation. The moment when the mask no longer works. It doesn't matter how polished the performance is, or how convincing the lies sound, or how confident the suspect appears. Because once investigators see the cracks, the entire facade begins to crumble. And for Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson, that unraveling happened in very different but equally devastating ways. Scott's downfall came quietly, like a whisper turning into a siren. Drew's downfall came violently, like arrogance collapsing under its own weight. Both men believed they were smarter than everyone around them. Both believed they had crafted unbreakable narratives. Both believed their personalities, charm for Scott, confidence for Drew, could overpower the truth. But personality isn't protection. And in these cases, their personalities became their undoing. Part 1. Scott Peterson, the charm that couldn't hold. Scott always believed he would remain in control. He believed his calm demeanor made him look innocent. He believed his fishing alibi was airtight. He believed investigators would see him as a grieving husband, not a cold planner. But charm is fragile, and Scott's charm cracked the moment the truth he thought he'd buried came alive. The first crack, a lie that grew too large to hide. Investigators already sensed something was off with Scott's behavior, but they didn't know why until they uncovered the truth. He was having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. Not only was he cheating, he told Amber he was not married. And then, weeks before Laci disappeared, he told her he had lost his wife and this would be his first Christmas alone. That statement, that unbelievable slip, became the centerpiece of the entire investigation. Because what kind of husband predicts his wife is dead before she's even gone? Amber became the crack in Scott's mask that investigators had been waiting for. And once her voice entered the narrative, Scott's carefully crafted persona shattered instantly. The recordings, his own words exposing him. Amber agreed to cooperate with detectives. She recorded every call with Scott, and the tapes revealed something investigators rarely get to hear. A murderer trying to pretend he's innocent while talking to the woman he's trying to impress. Scott's voice in those recordings was calm, steady, smooth, exactly how he'd sounded on TV. But beneath that calmness was something darker. Manipulation, deception, emotional emptiness, an eagerness to maintain the fantasy life he'd built with Amber. In one call, he talked about New Year's celebrations, while the entire state was searching for his pregnant wife. In another call, he spoke tenderly to Amber. The same day, volunteers were combing fields and rivers for Laci. The contrast was damning. It revealed a man capable of compartmentalizing guilt so deeply that he could charm one woman, while the world searched for another. Scott wasn't just lying. He was living two parallel lives, and both lives were collapsing into each other. The public turns. Sympathy becomes outrage. When the affair went public, everything changed. The public went from, "He seems calm. Maybe he's innocent," to, "He lied to everyone. Something is wrong." Laci's family, who once embraced Scott with genuine love, immediately pulled away. Investigators no longer saw a struggling husband. They saw a man with a powerful motive. That shift, the moment charm failed, marked the beginning of Scott's downfall. And it only got worse. The discovery of the bodies, the worst possible location. When the remains of Laci and baby Connor washed ashore near the Berkeley Marina, the exact place Scott claimed to be fishing, his alibi transformed from a story into a prison. His entire defense collapsed under one devastating question. Why were the bodies found where Scott said he'd been, if he had nothing to do with their deaths? Innocent coincidence. Impossible. He couldn't explain it. He didn't try to. That silence was louder than any confession. Scott's charm had carried him through interviews, vigils, and early investigation days. But charm cannot explain why your wife and unborn child wash ashore at your alibi location. Charm cannot erase timelines. Charm cannot cover motive. Charm cannot undo lies. Charm cracks. And Scott's charm shattered completely the day Laci and Connor's bodies surfaced. The arrest that felt like inevitability. When Scott was arrested, he was carrying $15,000 in cash, traveling with camping gear, holding his brother's ID, planning to dye his hair, preparing to flee the country. A man running doesn't look like a man grieving. By then, investigators didn't need a confession. They didn't need a weapon. They didn't need an eyewitness. They had everything they needed: motive, timeline, lies, behavior, bodies, evidence of escape. Scott believed charm could save him. But charm is thin. Charm evaporates. Charm collapses under the weight of truth. Scott's downfall wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. Part 2. Drew Peterson, the arrogance that destroyed him. If Scott fell quietly, Drew went down in flames. His downfall wasn't subtle. It wasn't slow. It wasn't hidden beneath layers of performance. It was loud, public, chaotic, almost theatrical. Because Drew Peterson didn't just underestimate investigators. He openly mocked them. And arrogance, real arrogance, is a self-destructing weapon. The media monster he created. When Stacy disappeared, Drew didn't hide. He became a media fixture, smirking, joking, flirting, insulting, performing. He believed confidence made him immune. He believed arrogance made him untouchable. He believed his police background made him smarter than forensic teams, psychologists, and prosecutors combined. But the truth is simple. Every time Drew spoke, he incriminated himself. Reporters noticed inconsistencies. Investigators noticed red flags. The public noticed cruelty. Drew was creating his own villain narrative on national television, and he was too arrogant to realize it. The exhumation that changed everything. Drew's downfall became irreversible the moment Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed. Because arrogance blinds killers, and Drew never expected a second autopsy. But Stacy's disappearance forced investigators to re-examine Kathleen's death, and what they found destroyed Drew's entire story. The bathtub accident wasn't an accident. The injuries weren't consistent with a fall. The bruises suggested force. The scene showed signs of staging. The timeline contradicted Drew's claims. Suddenly, Drew's past, which he believed was buried, rose from the grave. Kathleen's voice, silenced for years, now echoed louder than ever. And it said exactly what she warned during her life. If I die, it will not be an accident. Her own words became evidence. And those words were amplified by the forensic findings that exposed Drew's lie. Drew's public arrogance made people look deeper. And what they found was devastating. Stacy's confessions, the blow he could never recover from. Before Stacy disappeared, she confided a horrifying truth through her pastor. Drew killed Kathleen, and she knew how. This revelation became the connective tissue between both cases. It showed motive, continuity, escalation, pattern. Stacy didn't just fear Drew. She witnessed what she believed to be proof of murder. And then she vanished. Arrogance makes killers high risk. It makes them sloppy. It makes them overconfident. Stacy's disappearance pushed investigators into action, and Drew's arrogance pushed them harder. The downfall, a psychological collapse. Let's compare the precise moment each man fell. Scott fell when the evidence matched his lie. When Laci and Connor's bodies washed up near his fishing spot, Scott's alibi turned into a confession. Drew fell when his arrogance triggered deeper investigation. His overconfidence forced investigators to reopen Kathleen's case. And exhumation sealed his fate. Two very different collapses, but both rooted in the same truth. They thought they were smarter than everyone else, and they weren't. The human factor. Why they failed. Investigators didn't beat Scott and Drew through evidence alone. They beat them through psychology. Scott's failure came from emotional emptiness. He couldn't replicate real human grief. He couldn't maintain the perfect husband mask under pressure. He couldn't hide his motives. Drew's failure came from narcissistic overconfidence. He believed he was untouchable. He talked too much, too often, too casually. He underestimated everyone. Their internal flaws, charm and arrogance, were the exact traits they believed would protect them. But those flaws revealed the truth. Charm cracks under pressure. Arrogance collapses under scrutiny. The truth survives both. Why this section matters for the documentary. Section 6 delivers one of the most powerful themes of the entire story. Killers don't fall because justice is perfect. They fall because their flaws betray them. Scott Peterson fell because he tried to act like something he wasn't. Drew Peterson fell because he believed he didn't have to act at all. One collapsed quietly. One collapsed loudly. But in both cases, the downfall wasn't about evidence. It was about who they were. And that is the message that prepares the viewer for the final chapter. There is a moment in every true crime story when the facts begin to fade, and something deeper rises to the surface. Not the evidence, not the timelines, not the legal arguments, but the truth. The truth that sits quietly beneath every interview, every search effort, every courtroom testimony. The truth that investigators feel long before they can prove it. The truth that the public senses when a story stops making sense. The truth that victims leave behind in patterns, behaviors, warnings, and disappearances. And in the cases of Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson, the truth was never delivered by a weapon or a confession. It was revealed through circumstance, through moments that didn't align, through details that didn't fit, through stories that contradicted reality, through behavior that defied the logic of innocence. Because in the world of criminal investigations, evidence doesn't always come in the form of a fingerprint. Sometimes it comes in the form of a husband who is too calm, a husband who is too confident, a timeline that doesn't make sense, a story that shifts with every retelling, a smile where there should be fear, a lie where there should be truth, a silence where there should be urgency. Circumstantial evidence is not a shadow of doubt, and it is the shape of truth when a killer thinks he has erased everything else. And that is what ultimately brought justice to Laci Peterson, Connor, Kathleen Savio, and Stacy Peterson. The myth of the smoking gun. The public loves the idea of a smoking gun, a weapon left behind, a confession bloated out, a piece of evidence that ties everything together in one clean moment. But real investigations rarely work that way. Real killers don't leave souvenirs, especially not killers like Scott and Drew Peterson. They wanted the world to believe that nothing tied them to the crimes. No murder weapon, no witnesses, no DNA, no fingerprints. But killers forget something they cannot erase. You cannot stage your soul. You cannot fake humanity. You cannot lie consistently forever. Scott tried to hide behind calmness. Drew tried to hide behind arrogance. Both misunderstood the most important truth of criminal psychology. Behavior is evidence. A killer's decisions, even the ones he believes are clever, are the clearest reflections of guilt. When Scott implied he was a widower before Laci disappeared, that was evidence. When Drew joked on national television while Stacy was missing, that was evidence. When Scott refused to show urgency, when Drew refused to show fear, when both men refused to show real human grief, that was evidence. Patterns tell stories, even when bodies cannot. In Drew's case, investigators had to piece together a pattern stretching across marriages. A pattern of domination, emotional manipulation, escalating violence, threats, fear, control, prior accidents, predicted danger. Kathleen Savio's death was not isolated. It was the blueprint. Stacy Peterson's disappearance was not shocking. It was the tragic continuation of a pattern that had gone unchecked for decades. Drew believed his history made him untouchable, but it made him predictable, and predictability is a pattern. A pattern is evidence, and evidence leads to truth. In Scott's case, the pattern looked different, but it existed all the same. His double life, detachment, lack of emotion, secretly planning a new identity, absence of genuine grief. These were not the actions of a desperate husband. They were the actions of a man who saw his wife and unborn child as obstacles. Scott didn't have multiple victims. He had a single plan. But plans leave signatures too, and signatures are evidence. Circumstantial, powerful, inescapable. Why these cases changed public perception? These two cases left a permanent mark on true crime history because they challenged one widespread belief. If there's no physical evidence, the suspect must be innocent. But Scott and Drew showed the world a different truth, a truth investigators already understood. Physical evidence is not required to find justice. Physical evidence is not the backbone of every case. Physical evidence is not the only path to truth. Because killers who know how to hide evidence often reveal themselves in everything else. Their words, their contradictions, their timelines, their behavior, their patterns, their past, their relationships, their reactions, their egos. These things create a picture stronger than any fingerprint. A picture the jury can see. A picture the public can feel. A picture the investigators can connect. And once the picture is clear, the absence of a weapon no longer matters. Two men who believed they were untouchable. The final reflection of this documentary lies not only in what they did, but in who they were. Scott believed that if he acted calm enough, people would believe him. He underestimated human intuition. Drew believed that if he acted confident enough, people would fear questioning him. He underestimated human resilience. Scott tried to escape responsibility. Drew tried to dominate it. Scott thought he could live a second life in secret. Drew thought his first life made him immune. Both believed they were smarter than the people searching for the truth. Both believed they could manipulate reality. Both believed they could control the narrative forever. But narratives fall apart. Masks slip. Patterns emerge. And guilt has a way of showing itself even in the absence of a single fingerprint. These men were not caught because of perfect investigations. They were caught because of flawed personalities. Scott was undone by his coldness. Drew was undone by his arrogance. And that is why circumstantial evidence doesn't merely suggest guilt. It reveals it. A final message to the viewer. This story is not just about two men who committed unforgivable crimes. It's about the strength of the human voice, even after death. It's about Kathleen Savio predicting her own fate. It's about Stacy Peterson wanting to leave but never getting the chance. It's about Laci Peterson preparing for motherhood, unaware of the danger beside her. It's about baby Connor, whose life ended before it began. It's about families who refused to stop searching. It's about investigators who refused to stop digging. It's about communities who refused to look away. It's about the truth rising, slowly, painfully, relentlessly, until justice could finally be served. And it's about understanding the power of circumstances, behavior, patterns, and psychology. Because in the end, circumstantial doesn't mean uncertain. Circumstantial doesn't mean weak. Circumstantial doesn't mean accidental. Circumstantial means the truth left footprints, even when the killer thought he erased every trace. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into one of the most unsettling comparisons in modern true crime. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the voices of victims deserve to be heard and their lessons remembered, I invite you to stay connected. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and it allows me to continue creating long-form documentaries that reveal the truth behind the headlines. If you want more cases like this, leave a comment below. Tell me which story you want me to cover next, or what part of this case stood out to you the most. And as always, thank you for watching, for thinking critically, and for helping keep these stories alive.